If you've ever been to a big stadium, a football match, a concert, anything with tens of thousands of people packed into tiered rows, you've probably never once questioned why everyone has an assigned seat. It just seems obvious. Of course there are seats. Of course everyone has a numbered ticket that matches a numbered chair. That's just how stadiums work. Except it isn't, and it never used to be. For most of the 20th century, the biggest, loudest, most electric sections of major stadiums, especially in football, weren't seats at all. They were terraces, huge sloped concrete steps where tens of thousands of fans crammed in shoulder to shoulder, standing the entire game, swaying as one enormous mass whenever something exciting happened. No assigned spot, no barrier keeping you from the person 3 rows down. Just you, thousands of strangers, and whatever the crowd decided to do with its own momentum. And in April of 1989, that design killed 96 people in about 6 minutes and changed stadium architecture permanently, everywhere, forever. This is the story of how one afternoon at a football match in Sheffield, England, is the actual reason every stadium you've sat in since has had a specific numbered seat with your name basically on it. Let's back up first, because the terrace itself wasn't some accident of laziness. It was, for decades, considered a completely reasonable design. Standing terraces let stadiums pack in far more spectators than seating ever could, which meant cheaper tickets and bigger crowds, both of which clubs liked quite a bit. Fans generally liked it too. There's a very real, very specific atmosphere that comes from thousands of people standing, chanting, and moving together that an all-seated crowd simply doesn't replicate. And to this day, some fans will tell you something was lost when it went away. So for most of English football's history, terraces weren't the dangerous exception. They were just the normal way you watched a match. The problem is that a design built entirely around dense standing crowds is also a design with almost no way to control what happens when that crowd suddenly needs to move, fast, all at once in the same direction. And this had already gone badly wrong once before, nearly 20 years before Hillsborough, at a stadium called Ibrox in Glasgow. In January of 1971, during a match between Rangers and Celtic, a crush on a stairway leaving the standing terrace killed 66 people. The official investigation afterward pointed to exactly what you'd expect: a narrow stairway, no barriers to control flow, and a crowd surge with nowhere to safely go. Some safety improvements followed. Rangers rebuilt sections of their stadium, but the fundamental design, massive open standing terraces feeding into narrow exits, remained the standard everywhere else in English and Scottish football. The warning had been about as clear as a warning gets, and the sport largely treated it as a one-off tragedy at one specific ground rather than proof that the entire underlying system had a flaw. Which brings us to April 15th, 1989, an FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest, played at Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield, on a terrace called the Leppings Lane End. The details of exactly what went wrong that day were argued over for literally decades afterward, through inquiries, inquests, and one final, definitive investigation that took until 2016 to conclude. But the short version is this: thousands of fans arrived later than expected, and rather than managing the growing crowd outside the ground carefully, police made the decision to open a large exterior gate to relieve pressure at the turnstiles. That gate fed directly into an already packed central section of the standing terrace, which had no way to safely absorb a sudden new surge of people. There was no live monitoring of how full each section actually was. There were no safe channels to redirect the crowd once it became clear the central pens were dangerously overcrowded. Within minutes, people at the front were being crushed against the perimeter fencing that had specifically been installed to keep fans off the pitch, and which now made it almost impossible for anyone to escape the crush by climbing over. 96 people died. Hundreds more were injured. It remains to this day the deadliest disaster in British sporting history. And here's where the story becomes less about the disaster itself and more about what British society decided to actually do about it. Because unlike after Ibrox, this time the response didn't stop at a few local safety upgrades. The government commissioned an inquiry led by a judge named Lord Justice Taylor, and the resulting document, now simply known as the Taylor Report, didn't just examine what specifically went wrong that one afternoon. It examined the entire underlying premise of the standing terrace as a form of stadium design, and its central, sweeping conclusion was blunt. Standing terraces, in their existing form, were not compatible with crowd safety at the scale modern football had reached, and the report recommended that England's top 2 divisions convert entirely to all-seated stadiums. This was, for many clubs, an enormous undertaking. All-seater stadiums hold noticeably fewer people than standing terraces of the same size, which meant lower matchday capacity and lower ticket revenue from every single game, indefinitely, going forward. Rebuilding or replacing stadium sections wasn't cheap either. The government did offer financial assistance to help clubs make the transition. But even with that support, this was one of the largest, most expensive architectural overhauls English football had ever gone through, forced through in the space of just a few years. By the mid-1990s, virtually every top-flight English stadium had been rebuilt or reconfigured, and standing sections in the form fans had known for a century were essentially gone from the top of the sport. And this is really the part of the story that explains why it matters far beyond English football specifically. Once the all-seater model became the standard at the highest level of one of the most popular sports on the planet, it didn't stay contained to England. Stadium designers, architects, and safety regulators elsewhere started treating assigned individual seating as the default expectation for any major modern venue. Not just football grounds, but stadiums built for essentially any large-scale event. The specific numbered seat, the ticket that corresponds to an exact spot. The idea that a stadium's capacity is a precise, countable number rather than however many bodies could physically be squeezed onto a terrace. All of that traces directly back to a government report written in response to one specific afternoon in Sheffield. There's actually a small postscript worth mentioning here too, because the story of standing at football didn't end quite as cleanly as it disappeared forever. In the years since, a compromise design called safe standing has slowly started reappearing at some stadiums, mostly in Germany and, more recently, parts of the UK. It uses individual, ticketed spots with sturdy barriers between rows, engineered specifically to prevent the kind of uncontrolled crowd surge that caused both Ibrox and Hillsborough, while still letting fans stand if they want to. It's a small sign that the goal was never really standing itself is inherently dangerous. It's that standing, at the scale and design football had been using for a century, had a fatal blind spot that nobody fully reckoned with until it was forced to. So the next time you sit down in a numbered seat at a stadium, any stadium, for any event, and don't think twice about it, that seat exists because of a very specific chain of decisions and failures. A design nobody questioned for decades, a warning at Ibrox that got treated as an isolated tragedy instead of a pattern, and finally, in 1989, a crush that killed 96 people and forced an entire country, and eventually much of the world, to rebuild the way it watches sports from the ground up.